On your call with Vladimir Putin?
Well, we'll be speaking. We'll be speaking, and I think we'll perhaps do something that'll be significant. We want to end that war. That war would have never started if I was president, and we want to end that war. That war is a horrible war. It's got to stop. So whatever I can do to stop it, and we are having discussions, yes.
Ongoing, already scheduled and ongoing?
Already talking, yes.
So you've already spoken to Vladimir Putin?
I don't want to say that, but we are having very serious discussions.
Is there a reason you don't want to?
We are, well, I just don't want to say that. Okay. We're having very serious discussions about that war, trying to get it ended.
With Russia?
With Russia, yeah.
Donald Trump just late last night, actually, he made that first admission that what we've been asking about a long time, ever since he's taken over as the president of the United States, is to, okay, what's the plan? When are we going to start talking? And apparently they have been talking. He implied it wasn't him directly with Putin. I think that makes sense, that you don't want to lead with that, I don't think. But you do want your senior officials talking with senior Russian officials to try and see if you can start mapping out what the contours are going to look like. And so far, we haven't heard anything about any discussions. And this was the first time that Trump himself expressly said, yes, there are discussions. They are serious talks, and they are happening at the highest levels within Russia. So now then the question, of course, is what is Trump's plan? What is his intention? What is he going to try to accomplish here? Because we know what Zelensky wants. We know what many in Europe want. We even know what the Russians want, which we're going to be talking about here shortly. But the real question is, and probably what's going to determine how this thing is solved, is what does Trump want? Because it is vitally important to understand that, because we want to see how likely it is that outcome can be accomplished, whatever he's trying to get. Does he try to get something that's realistic and reasonable, something that can be done relatively quickly? Or is he going to try to hold out for a better deal and trying to get some terms that the Russians aren't willing to give, and which could, in case the war could drag out longer? Those are the things we still want to know, because he didn't come across with a lot of, or actually any detail in that. But we're going to try and piece together what is his plan as best we can. And there have been some things floated. There was a couple of things just in the last few days that were allegedly leaked that may be some of the terms of his plan, which was no NATO, but then closer ties militarily with the United States, that they would have possibly peacekeepers on the ground, that it would be a frozen conflict on the current line of contact. Russia would get, quote, get to keep all of its stuff, etc. And that there would be possibly peacekeepers involved with this from whatever nations, if they wanted to do that. Those things were allegedly on the table, and they would see how it would work. There would be some sanctions relief if Russia played nice. There would be more sanctions placed on if Russia didn't play nice, etc. Those are rumors right now. We don't have any. We certainly haven't had anything by any official publicly stated, so we have to try and piece those things together. Now, last night, we thought we were going to get some information here, because General Kellogg, the Putin's envoy to try and solve the Russia-Ukraine war, went on Fox News. And the reason why we're not going to show you any of that, because it was 6 painful minutes that I'll never get back in my life, because I watched all 6 of them. And it was like a banter back and forth between Brett Baer of Fox News and General Kellogg. Baer trying to get him to say anything at all. And instead, all Kellogg would do repeatedly is just say again this whole mantra that Trump is a great negotiator. I have a lot of confidence in him. I think he's going to get it done. He still said that 100 days. We still want to get it done in 100 days. But he never said what it was. What are the contours? What do you want to accomplish, etc. Said none of those things. Now, partially, I can say, well, I understand that. I mean, if you're in the middle of negotiations, you don't want to tip your hand and tell people what you're trying to accomplish here. But then you have to ask the question, well, then why come on at all? Why spend time to go on Fox News and then not say anything at all? I mean, you'd been better off just remaining silent, because I'm sure I'm not the only one that's frustrated by what he's trying to say here. And I can assure you that people in Kiev are paying a great deal of attention, and also probably went painfully through that whole 6 minutes, wonder if he was going to say anything positive from their side or give them any reason for hope. I didn't see any reason for hope in there. And based on what we can also piece together from what the Russian side is saying, things are not really looking that great and we've been talking about this for a long time, leverage for the Trump side. If they are trying to hold out for a, quote, better deal or anything that's relatively good for the Ukraine side, I think that he's going to be in for some long, fruitless negotiations. And we're going to talk about what that means, because there are some significant ramifications if that's the path we're going down to. First of all, in Doha 2 days ago, we had Sergey Lavrov was being interviewed, and they were asking him some questions about how he thinks this thing's going to end. In the process of doing that, he said, listen, we also have to understand the core causes of this war, which I think are problematic. And by the way, this thing could have come to an end if the Biden administration had just been willing to negotiate.
I hope you can at some point interview somebody from the Biden administration, because everything they do indicates that they persuade Europeans not to believe in Russian red lines. Mr. Kirby at the White House, he was asked whether the US is concerned about possible escalation. He said, yes, we are, because if nuclear weapons are used, Europe would suffer. Mentally, he cannot even think about the fact that the US can suffer. With this mentality, it's very reckless for the current administration to push and push and push Europeans to the brink. So I hope reason would prevail. There are wise people in the United States, and we hope that they would be taking the final decision and not those who play with fire.
Now, I think that's important that was just 2 days ago. Why would you suppose Sergey Lavrov would be wanting to go back to the Biden administration, who's now out of power and they're no longer a player, to reiterate this issue of, I hope there are wise people in Washington who understand there are Russian red lines. And I think that the reason for that is because Russia will be taking a tough negotiating positions. And if the Trump administration doesn't recognize its red lines and tries to cross them, or if the European Union does, or anybody other NATO country tries to, then I think he's laying out a very stark warning. There are Russian red lines. It was popular during the Trump-Biden administration to just kind of ignore that and say, well, it's not real. There are no real red lines. We tried it with the missiles. We tried it with the tanks. We tried it with the artillery pieces and even the F-16s, long-range missiles, blah, 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 and they never did anything about it. Those were mostly American red lines that we self-imposed on Russia. And then when we crossed them, we said, see, they didn't do anything. Now, the one possible exception to that is the long-range missiles, where Russia said there would be consequences if those were used. Those have been used in minor areas, and so far, there hasn't been any big responses. There were some tactical responses. Nearly every time we used them, there were missiles, a big missile barrage that would fall on Ukraine subsequent to that. But everybody in the West, and certainly the United States, just said, didn't bother us any, so I'm not worried about that. Because apparently many in the West are only worried about any escalations outside the borders of Ukraine. So some still have the view that there really aren't any Russian red lines. They're never going to risk going against us. So literally we can do whatever we want, and they'll just, complain and bitch and moan a little bit in Moscow, but then at the end of the day, they're not going to do anything. I'm not sure that that's a safe bet. And I think that the fact that that's being reiterated here right now, as apparently discussions have already started, even by the time he made those comments, that we need to be sober-minded about what we're trying to do here. Now, in terms of how this can be resolved, I want to show you a couple of clips from Sergey Lavrov's interview with Tucker Carlson in November after Trump had been elected. And he asked him a couple of questions about, number one, how are you going to, what is the requirements? What does Russia want to solve this thing? And to explain what they're going to do now, he explained what was on the table during March and April of 2022.
That was April 22.
Right.
Which was no NATO, but security guarantees to Ukraine collectively provided with the participation of Russia. And these security guarantees would not cover Crimea or the east of Ukraine. It was their proposal. And it was initialed. and the head of the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul, who is now the chair of the Zelensky faction in the parliament, he recently, a few months ago, in an interview, he confirmed that this was the case. And on the basis of these principles, we were ready to draft a treaty.
Okay, I said November, you saw on the screen there. That was actually December 5th. Important to note there, what he's saying, and this is really important. We talked about this a little bit. We've had Colonel Jacques Beau on to talk about this in detail, and he actually drew up a map. This is what, when Lavrov referred to it, he said this was not going to include Crimea, and it was not going to include the east of Ukraine. That's what he meant by those. That's the Luhansk and the Donetsk republics, which, just kind of background, at that time, and actually just happened just before the Russia's invasion began, the Luhansk and Donetsk had declared independence. And initially, Russia went in there to help those newly independent countries, as they referred to them as. And so any negotiated settlement that was going to come out of the war barely a month in was going to say, yeah, those aren't ever coming back. Those are now independent, which almost certainly we knew from the beginning they were going to be annexed into Russian territory later on. But that's what the map would have looked like had we agreed to that declaration there. Just take a gander at that, and just imagine how what I'm going to show you here in a minute was the next offer, which came on June 14th. And that's going to form the basis of what Russia is saying now, because in that same interview, Tucker Carlson said, okay, that's what would have been in April of 2022, but what will it be now that Trump's coming in to negotiate?
What are the terms to which you'd agree?
Well, the terms, I basically alluded to them when President Putin spoke in this ministry on the 14th of June. He once again reiterated that we were ready to negotiate on the basis of the principles which were agreed in Istanbul and rejected by Boris Johnson, according to the statement of the head of the Ukrainian delegation. The key principle is no non-block status of Ukraine, and we would be ready to be part of the group of countries who would provide collective security guarantees to
no
Ukraine.
NATO.
No NATO, absolutely. No military bases. No military exercises on the Ukrainian soil with participation of foreign troops. And this is something which he reiterated. But of course, he said it was April 2022. Now some time has passed. And the realities on the ground would have to be taken into account and accepted.
And those realities were articulated by President Putin on the 14th of June. You heard him refer there to the Putin lines, and he actually accelerated or increased a little bit above that, which was no NATO exercises, no foreign troops, etc. So those are some very, very important issues. But because he referred to the 14 June lines, I want to show you now what Putin actually did say on the 14th of June.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now, that's important that he mentioned there, the demilitarization and denazification, because when you consider that the denazification, what the Russians mean by that is the Kiev regime, the one that's currently in place right now by Volodymyr Zelensky. So he's kind of expanding on it a little bit between what we've been talking about, not just the June 14th lines, which in that the discussion there with what would have happened in March and April of 2022, you didn't hear him say anything about the denazification, meaning that Zelensky could have continued to be in power even at that time. But for those of you who may not have seen, let me show you real quick. These are the June 14th lines right here. This, of course, now in the previous screen that I showed you, you saw this was the area that was in red, that in April of 2022, if the war had ended there, if the West had agreed to the tentative discussions that Russia and Ukraine themselves had come up with, it would have been roughly this area right here. Now then you see that Russia has, since that time, the realities on the ground that Lavrov keeps referring to, is now all of this territory is possessed by Russia, and the June 14th lines include these gray areas that are up here. That's the administrative borders of the 4 regions. So for this war to end in the current phase with Trump and then therefore Zelensky will have to agree for the withdrawal of all of these Ukrainian units that are currently defending in all these areas. They would have to willingly relocate and give all of this territory up. That's just the reality of what he's talking about. But then we also see that Lavrov keeps talking about now then the denazification, meaning the terms could be even more harsh than that. It may not merely be that ground, but it may also be that the Zelensky is not going to be allowed to be in part of what comes next. We've seen Putin himself talk about some of this recently by saying, yeah, Zelensky can be involved with the negotiations, but we're not going to sign anything with him. We're not going to end the war with him because he is an illegitimate president. He went past his term of service. He is not recognized by international standards as being the president, so somebody else is going to have to do that. And we'll see how that turns out there. But you're seeing that the Russians are setting up some pretty harsh conditions. Now, the question has to be answered. Is this just posturing by the Russian side? Can they make good on this? Well, yes, they can. And this is something that is so important to understand if you're trying to figure out how this is going to end. If you're a Ukrainian and you want to know what is actually possible, what's the best that we can get, we need to understand that there's not a good deal for Ukraine. There's no positive thing that's going to be acceptable, that's going to be desirable by the Ukraine side, as would have been the case in April of 2022. Now then, the question is, how bad is it going to be? I'm just being blunt with you and honest. There is no good solution that's possible from the Ukrainian point of view, meaning that President Trump is going to have to agree to something that's ugly for the Ukraine side. Here's the catch. If he doesn't, if he delays and tries to keep pressing for a better deal, then it can be, instead of an ugly deal, it can be a catastrophic deal for Ukraine. That's the very narrow band where we're now in. It's either going to be a bad/ugly deal for Ukraine, or it's probably going to be a catastrophic defeat. And let me show you why. So we've had this I think actually was from back in November. Retired General Kemet, U.S. General Kemet, was being asked about what the conditions were on the ground. Now, you know, I usually put up a lot of stuff here showing the former American generals in a negative light, but this is one of the few times that I'm going to say, no, this guy's on it, and he was speaking absolutely honestly. I believe this was a Wall Street Journal report that came out, and he was asked, first of all, what about the EU? What can they do in this current environment to help Ukraine?
The expense to the European economies to provide weapons and equipment is starting to bite. They don't have that excess capacity, for one. They don't have the industrial capability to produce replacements, two. And three, as we, the United States, continue to press for them to meet their NATO obligations, to do all of that is a pretty tough call on the Europeans.
Tough call, meaning they don't have it and they're not going to do it. And we know that that's the case because they've already, I mean, you see a little incremental stuff here and there. You had this big swath in preparation for the 2023 Ukrainian offensive that was, disastrously, infamously fell apart. And there, since that time, there has just been incremental gifts here and there, a handful of air defense missiles, a couple of air defense systems, a few tanks here and there. They've added a little bit more here. We gave them, I think, a whopping 6 F-16s. My understanding is at least 2 of which were either destroyed or shot down. Well, I think one was actually destroyed on a tarmac by a Russian missile. And you never heard anything from any reports after they were put in there, because they had absolutely no difference, as we knew they would, because there's just too few of them, and there hasn't been anything else offered. Because already we also know, because of things I've showed you before, that the United States itself, the so-called instrument of democracy and the arsenal of democracy, well, even we had to hesitate when we gave them stuff, because we ourselves couldn't backfill our own inventories to make sure we didn't fall critically low in some of these categories. So we delayed how much stuff we even sent of the limited things we did. You can imagine it is far, far less capable for the European Union, as General Kellogg pointed out there. There are significant limitations, and nobody else is going to want to dip into their own national security and put themselves at risk in the event that the war spreads, just to help a losing Ukraine. If it were only that issue, that alone would be enough to say, this is just not going to work out for Ukraine. They're not going to be able to reverse anything on the battlefield. That's if it was only that. It's not. There's also an even more fundamental problem for the Ukraine, and that is Ukrainian manpower, as Kimmett also explained.
Troubling, it is now the case that they're sending some of those older men into the trench lines. It's clear that Zelensky wants to protect the 18 to 25-year-old cohort, because that's the future of Ukraine, both in available military if necessary, but really to rebuild the post-war economy that will come. Unfortunately, many of those are defecting or deserting. So in my mind, Zelensky's got a personnel issue, not only in terms of sheer numbers, but also in terms of support for the war among the military.
And because that's something that we feature on this channel all the time, those numbers are growing. That was in November, early November. Well, now then, the Guardian, I believe this was 2 days ago, is saying, had this piece coming out about the current Ukrainian rates, and it says after 3 years of war, Ukraine is desperately short of soldiers, especially infantry. This has made it easier for Russia's army to advance in the east. There are structural issues too. New brigades have been built from scratch. They performed poorly. A certain analyst there, whose name I won't butcher, said there were hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers staying in their positions and not going anywhere. That's, folks, in addition to the allegedly somewhere around 120,000 who have outright abandoned. That's telling you that hundreds of thousands don't even get out of their trenches to fight. When they're ordered to, like, say, for example, conduct local counterattacks in the defensive, they're not doing it because they view that as suicidal. And so now then you see the results on the battlefield is that the continued moving west of the line of contact. And the Ukraine side is losing soldiers every day. I've also shown you that General Sergey himself about 2 weeks ago admitted that everything they're doing to force mobilize people is not even offsetting the losses. So just consider what that means in cumulative added up. The Ukraine side doesn't have enough manpower to offset losses. So they're physically shrinking. Of the ones that are brought in, a large number of them leave and quit the fighting. Of those that don't leave and quit the fighting, a large number of them don't do the fighting. So now that leaves you a strikingly small number of people to actually fight that causes, just a slowing down of the Russian side. Meanwhile, we have on the Russian side, they are continuing to escalate and elevate the number of troops that they get. They're still able to recruit. They have still not resorted to mobilization besides that first tranche in late 2022. They are still able to recruit more than they lose every day. And because of that, their now force is growing. It's up to about 1.5 million active troops. And that gives them the luxury of training their new recruits, giving them a lot longer to prepare before they even move to the line of contact. Once they get to the line of contact, they have the luxury of fighting the way you're supposed to, which is that a unit will go in and fight until it gets to some level of attrition or it's worn out too much. Then they can rotate the unit out. They can put reinforcements back in. They give them time to rest and recuperate. Meanwhile, they move a new one in. And so you see the balance of power. Everywhere you look, there is not the European capacity to provide help or the Ukrainian ability to even maintain a stable army. It's inevitable. It is inevitable that at some point the force will become so weakened that it will literally break somewhere. And once that happens, we know for certain that the Russians have enough troops that they can roll into that breach. And if the army has broken, especially if it runs, then there's no one to stop the Russians, even in the areas where there may be defensive fortifications. If there's no one there to man them, Russia can literally drive across Ukraine. That hasn't happened yet, but it is playing with fire to think that this can continue on much longer. It's just inevitable, because that's just how armies work. That's how men fight. They do have a breaking point. It's not just going to go on forever.
So how were things going? I mean, last time I talked to you was 3 months ago. How was the situation on the front line?
For real, I think situation not really good for me. It's we all tired. We all tired. We wanna peace.
We lack. We need manpower. We need equipment. The main thing is the abundance of Russian equipment. There's just too much. There's too many soldiers and stuff.
It's really hard. It's really hard. We don't have enough people.
So what do you want to see happen? Like you say, peace.
I wanna be sure about its war didn't come in to my home again. Like I wanna hear from politics, hear from my president, hear from Trump maybe, or somebody else.
Why don't the politicians do their work and sort this thing out? We need Western help for this thing to stop it right here. We do, 110%. If we don't get it, I honestly don't think we're going to be able to hold it for much longer.
Here is one Ukrainian trooper here just very recently was put on trial for his desertion. And he very boldly told the judge exactly why he did what he did.
Your Honor, respected citizens, for 5 years I've been defending Ukraine, agreeing to a temporary restriction of my personal freedom because it was necessary, because Russia attacked us. Today it feels like I am on trial not for desertion, but for having the courage to say that soldiers are not slaves. If we carry on fighting like today with exhausted infantrymen, they will end up mobilizing the police inspector too, and the prosecutor. But later, when the Russian army will again be at the gates of Kyiv.
That last part there is pretty bold. When the Russian army will be at the gates of Kyiv. This is a soldier who's saying that he sees the consequence of what I'm talking about and understands the risk that they're facing. If you keep going like you are, if you keep pretending like we'll still just force enough soldiers into uniform and force them up to the front lines, and that we'll just keep being able to fight indefinitely, and that we'll never have any consequence to that in terms of the outcome of the war, is fantasy. Here's this guy, right? I mean, he's one voice, but I assure you, he is one of many who feel the same way. That's why there are so many who are refusing to fight or outright running away, because they recognize that there's no outcome. And he's just saying, like, yeah, even you, even prosecutors, even lawyers, the policemen who are behind me, all the stuff, you guys are going to be thrown in, because that's all there's going to be left. And of course, once you get to that stage, and you're already there in many respects, the war is over. So where does that leave us then? What does that leave the Trump administration coming in? What kind of a deal? Trump is going to be looking to have a face saving out. That's what he wants. He wants to look strong. You saw in that clip I played at the opening of this show that he says, "Yep, we're going to get a deal done." I'm very confident. We've shown you some of the stuff that Kellogg has said. Yes, I have a lot of confidence in Trump that he's going to be able to get this deal done. He understands it has to be over, but we want to have something, a good deal. A good deal. Well, a good deal from whose perspective? Because if Trump comes in and make some kind of an agreement along the administrative borders of the four zones that the Ukraine side has already lost to Russia, that the Russia annexed, but hasn't completely captured all that. If Trump just gives that to Ukraine, to Russia, then of course he's going to come under a lot of condemnation, certainly from the outgoing administration, who will then claim, and you can just count on this, they'll say, we did everything in the world to set you up for success. We had given them all this stuff. You had $4 billion more of money that you could have used to help them. And instead, you just hand over to Vladimir Putin all this territory. Thanks, well done. You just surrendered everything that we get. That's what they'll say. There won't be any truth to that. That's why I'm telling you ahead of time, almost certainly what they're going to say, because I've seen them. They set the stage for that before they left office. It will be a lie. They have, in fact, set up Trump for disaster, not success, because the war was already over. And had they not, that administration, had they not refused to negotiate in April of 2022, had they not refused to negotiate in November of 2022, and don't forget that the New York Times has reported that when General Mark Milley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I've shown you this clip several times, said in November that if you want to negotiate a settlement, now is the time. Ukraine is probably at its high water mark. They just had 2 big battlefield victories. Russia's hurting. They just tried a big mobilization. They haven't even come close to ginning up all of their defense industrial base yet. That was the time. Now the New York Times is telling us that actually it was Anthony Blinken. Anthony Blinken said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep fighting. And so now you have that same Anthony Blinken who left office saying that he set up the incoming administration for success, and that Ukraine was able to increasingly stand on its own. You may recall that. We showed you that clip shortly before he left office. That was a lie. That was ridiculous. And now then Trump has to manage the difficulties here. So yes, he's going to take some political heat. It's not going to be true, but it's going to be there. And certainly all those who support the Democratic side will gleefully report that and just say it as though it's a fact. So he's going to take heat. There's no question about it. But Putin is going to get what he wants on the battlefield. Putin has set this stage. Can you imagine? You talk about political heat domestically. Can you imagine what kind of heat President Putin would face if he agreed to a ceasefire and an end of war on the current line of contact, not including those 4 administrative borders of those 4 oblasts? I mean, he would be run out of office on a rail. Even Putin, he is not immune to public opinion. I promise you that. He is not. Despite this so-called dictator status that we give him in the West, he does have limitations. And he's got a lot of pressure, by the way, on a war hawk of his own side on there, by the way. And here's one example of it on the screen right here. This is from today, by the way. This is from the Military Review. It's a Russian website. It's translated here by Google Translate. And you see they're calling it Trump's not peace plan. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine did not arise yesterday or even the day before yesterday. It has a deep and tragic history. Therefore, it will not be possible to resolve these contradictions with a cowboy attack, which is what they view Trump's view, only through a just retribution of the Kiev regime and the destruction of Bandera on the western borders of Russia will peace finally come. So at least among the Military Review folks within that are writing in this in Russia publicly, which is putting pressure on Putin, they're saying, hey, it ain't just the line of contact. It's not even just the 4 oblasts. It's that we want this regime out of power here too. And I think that Putin is of the same mind here. Because in his view, the only reason they're fighting this war today, the only reason they had to fight it, is because the Kiev regime of Zelensky would not agree before the war started to say no, NATO was going to come into our country. Vladimir Putin, talk about red lines, he said this openly and apparently also privately to Biden and to NATO leaders, that if you continue with this idea to put NATO into Ukraine, there will be war. We'll use force of arms to stop this. And he said it, I think in as late as January of 2021, so a little over a month before he actually launched. He said he'll use military technical means if you don't stop. And then Stoltenberg and Biden and everybody else just said, nobody's going to tell us who's coming in NATO. They're coming in NATO. And so Putin said, very well, then you'll have your war. So that's what started there. Now then, the idea that he would end the war after all the price that the Russians have paid and all the blood that they have shed, that they would then allow the war to stop and leave that same guy in charge and all of his mindset and all the folks who were ideologically aligned with him in power seems pretty unlikely. Now, if Russia didn't have the capacity to do that, then they may be forced to, whether they want to or not. But as I've just shown you, Russians do have the capacity to make good on that threat to do, and the Ukraine side does not have the capacity, nor its Western supporters, to prevent it. So you see, we're starting to build up a clash of ideas here. And the question is, how far will Russia go? And then what would President Trump do, and by extension NATO do, if Russia continues to make good on its threat here? And listen, everything comes down to this 14 June line, because that's what Putin says apparently is his minimum requirements. But it's not just the line, it's also the political stuff here. So what do we do if Russia continues to move forward? Will Trump basically capitulate? Because that's how it's going to be viewed. I mean, and we just got to be honest about this, even among his supporters. If Trump, who is now setting the stage, is saying, I'm going to go in there and make a good deal, and you have Kellogg saying, yes, he's a great negotiator, he's going to make a good deal, and all of a sudden it's not a good deal. And it wouldn't be viewed as a good deal by anybody in the West if the current line of contact were given away more, and then also there had to be a change of leadership in Ukraine. Now, Russia can accommodate this, and Putin has said so publicly. He's saying this could be done via diplomacy, via the people in Ukraine voting. They can decide this. We don't have to go in and conquer Kiev. But the question is, what if he does? What if that is the only alternative? Because if Trump or Zelensky are not willing to do that, if they're not willing to have a presidential election, if they're not willing to change anything, if they're not willing to negotiate away those lines, then Russia is very possible to just continue on. And that's if the collapse of the army I've warned about doesn't happen. If somehow the army is able to just keep fighting and still go slower and slower, Russia has the ability to continue at that same level and almost certainly to press all the way up to Kiev, which you saw in that military review article. That's what the view is from the Russian side. And I can promise you, from looking at some Russian Telegram channels, there's people who are a lot more aggressive, as is some in the Russian media. This piece also was published just this morning that's saying, hey, if we have to go all the way down here, why stop there? Because that's going to leave this big problem of the Baltic states on our border, and we want to get that. We got rid of the Kiev issue and the NATO out of Ukraine. Well, let's get NATO off the rest of our borders in the north, part two, and let's go ahead and take the Baltic states. And listen, I mean, that sounds absurd that, of course, Russia wouldn't do that. Well, I mean, let's consider that militarily, the Baltics, and this is something that I've been saying for many, many years, actually, that it was a mistake, a ridiculous thing to bring the Baltics into NATO. Yeah, it looks good on paper, and it looks good diplomatically and militarily, or it looks good in terms of diplomacy and politically, but militarily, it was always going to be hard. You may recall, and I think it was 2019, the Rand Corporation published a paper that said if war came, and this is obviously before the Russia-Ukraine war, if war had come then, that the Russians would be able to, in about 30 days, to be able to easily overcome the ground forces on the ground in the Baltics and take them over. And that was with what we thought was a pretty good army. We now know at that time that army actually wasn't that good, and who knows if they could have done it. Well, now it's 500,000 stronger than it was before, and it's technologically superior in every way to the army of Russia in 2019. Meanwhile, the Baltic armies are maybe incrementally better than they were, but they don't have any combat experience, and obviously the Russians have quite a bit. In the event that the Russians decide that they're not going to stop at Kiev, and they continued to go, they could potentially, militarily speaking, drive in and take the Baltics. That was possible, and there's very practical reasons why the Rand report talked about how they could do it, because they said, which I acknowledged, and I talked about before, there is the difficulty of a very narrow band of territory that you can get Western troops even in there. So it would be really hard, especially if it was a no-notice kind of a deal, to even get ground troops in to protect them. The Article 5 would obviously be enacted immediately. And if conventional forces were tried to flow in there, Russia would be in a position to interdict them and to be able to swamp over the Baltics. That could absolutely happen militarily. Now, the question is, what about internationally? Because you have this little thing strategically called nuclear weapons, and that is the big danger. And hence we go back to that comment in Doha 2 days ago by Sergey Lavrov, and one has to wonder, are the Russians actually thinking this? Now, that was RIA Novosti that I showed you, that last piece there about the Baltics. So for that to be published, one would think that the people who published it would at least have had some sort of tacit discussions with the administration or the regime in Moscow. And so we have to wonder, are those things connected? Is Russia actually thinking that if we have to protect our borders, we're going to protect all of our borders? Now, this is just speculation at this point. I certainly don't have any insider information to what's happening inside of Moscow, but I'm looking at what's being said and what's being reported at the government level and at the media level. And we always talk about here in the West and demean the Russian media as being propaganda by the Kremlin. Well, if that's true, then is the Kremlin signaling this is what they're potentially going to do? And are we willing to risk nuclear war with Russia to prevent this from happening? I'm just telling you, as a rational thinking person, the best thing the Trump administration could do is to not even toy with this. Don't take any chance. Don't find out if they mean this or not. The best thing the Trump administration can do is agree to the June 14 lines. And there is some leverage that we have economically. There's some carrots and sticks that we could say, hey, if you're willing to give us, this on this side and agree to these things for, to give some kind of guarantees for what's left of Ukraine, as long as there's no NATO, we can do this, but we can also include European Union. There's certain things that we can also do that can help, et cetera. It's going to be tough, but there are some things that can be done here. And then you can put lipstick on a pig. You can say it's great. You can do whatever you want to do. You're going to be condemned no matter what by agreeing to anything to those administrative borders. But I promise you, that is far, far better than finding out if this is what Russia actually intends and if they're willing to actually press this. Because one nuclear weapon that gets used anywhere in life, as we all know it, comes to an end. And I'm not talking about mutually assured destruction initially, but I'm just talking about the security and where we think the lines are and the security we think we have will evaporate with the first usage, regardless of what happens next after that. We don't want to find out what that world looks like. All we've got to do is agree to this part here because that's the reality on the ground. Russia clearly has the capacity to make good on this, that they're going to go all the way to those administrative borders, possibly beyond that. They can do it. Ukraine can't stop them. The West can't stop them. The United States, short of intervening physically in the war, can't stop them. And obviously, that would also result in an almost certain escalation, and we would go to nuclear war. Almost certainly. The chances would be through the roof. And you see, there's just no good outcome for the United States to do anything short of those June 14th lines, however detestable that is to us. We have to understand this was not preordained. It didn't have to go down this way. We had every opportunity, at least 2 times in the year 2022, to prevent this outcome. And we had all kinds of opportunity from 2015 to 2021 to have prevented the war from happening at all. We've jettisoned all of those because there was too many people in the West that wanted to, quote, harm Russia. Well done, folks. Well done, guys. Boris Johnson, subsequently Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Joe Biden, et al. You have put us in a place now where now it's up to Trump to stop this flood at the current place it's at by only giving away this piece of territory and looking bad and doing it and handing a win and a victory to Russia. That's already ordained because of everything that happened prior to Trump's administration, prior to Trump's elevation here. What we have to hope now is that Trump is willing to take it's going to take an enormous amount of leadership and tough skin to be able to say, I'm going to make this deal because rational analysis shows this is what we're faced with. He can end it now and then face his difficulty and move on to whatever's next. And we can avoid this. And the whole risk of escalation can go back just, Cold War type level, something that's easily manageable. And there's no reason to think that it would ever escalate beyond that. Or he can try and push for something to look good. And where that would go from there. That's where we are, folks. That's the reality. And everybody in Washington, everybody in Brussels, London, Paris, et al., Kiev especially, needs to understand that's what's at stake here. It no longer matters what anybody in Kiev wants. It only matters what Moscow has the capacity to do. And it remains to be seen where he goes from there. But that's the truth of it, and you deserve to know, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised. We'll continue to bring you the truth no matter what it is. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys being here.
Hey, Danny, coming up next week, I just want to let everybody know what's going on Monday. If you remember, just this week, Donald Trump signed an executive order for the Iron Dome to be developed. So as you know, we're going to have Ted Postel on, the MIT professor who you guys have always appreciated. He's going to tell us about the realities of whether we can or cannot develop that. And then also, Danny, you know that Netanyahu's coming into town to meet with Trump on Tuesday. So we're going to have Chaz Freeman coming on to evaluate and hopefully we get some meaningful talk between the two of them, and he'll be analyzing exactly what goes on in those meetings.
Yeah, those are some big things there. Thanks for reminding me of those, Gary. Appreciate that. And I'm sure we're going to have some other, actually, I know we have some other guests too. So it's going to be a big week for us, and therefore a big week for you too, because we're always bringing you, this kind of stuff as it's breaking like we did today. So appreciate you guys very much. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on the way out. Also, remember, we are on podcasts. I know a lot of your friends maybe like to listen to things more than even to watch them. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, etc. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find it waiting there for you. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.